The woods of eastern Kentucky have always held their secrets close, thick canopies that swallow light, and whispers that carry too far on windless nights. But none of those secrets compare to what happened in the Hollow. Between 1993 and 2020, 312 people vanished from a stretch of land no bigger than a small town, their names fading from records as if they'd never existed. Locals don't speak of them. The county sheriff's office keeps the reports sealed, buried under unsolved missing persons files that no one dares reopen. And the few who once lived in the Hollow, a religious community that claimed to follow the old ways of salvation, either disappeared themselves or went mad before they could tell anyone what they'd seen. It began quietly. A single car left idling on a dirt road. A suitcase still zipped shut on a porch. A letter written but never mailed. No bodies. No trails. Just silence. Then the silence grew teeth. Travelers who took the wrong exit on Route 17 spoke of lights in the trees that moved against the wind, of hymns echoing from the forest long after midnight. Some said they saw figures in white, faces pale as chalk, standing motionless among the trees, watching. Others claimed to hear children laughing underground. When Ethan Cole arrived, a man who believed no mystery was too dark to be solved, the townspeople told him what they told everyone else: don't go near the Hollow. He didn't listen. He never does. But when the night came and the moon hung blood-red over the treetops, the last sound anyone heard from him was a single word broadcast through his recorder, a word that chilled even the sheriff to his bones. In the summer of 1993, the town of Willow Creek, Kentucky, was small enough that everyone still knew each other's business. So when 22-year-old Clara Boone vanished, it wasn't just news, it was an open wound. Clara wasn't the kind of person to disappear. She worked part-time at the local diner, always wore the same blue ribbon in her hair, and never left town without telling her mother. But that year, she'd started attending gatherings up in the hills, quiet meetings led by a new preacher who called himself Father Jeremiah. He spoke of salvation, of a world beyond the visible, and of the Hollow, a sacred piece of land where the chosen could hear the voice of God. To most townsfolk, it sounded like backwoods nonsense. But Clara, drawn to his calmness and strange certainty, began spending more and more time with him. Then one day, she was gone. Her mother found her car 2 miles outside the old logging trail that led into the Hollow. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the seat. The forest beyond was silent, not even the sound of birds. Sheriff Amos Ray led the search, combing the woods for 3 days with dogs and volunteers. They found nothing. No footprints. No torn clothing. No sign of struggle. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. Rumors spread quickly. Some said Clara ran away to start a new life with Father Jeremiah. Others whispered she had been taken, though no one could say by what. Then came the stranger part, the car itself. When investigators checked the engine, they found the battery drained completely, though the keys were still turned halfway in the ignition. The radio, somehow, was still faintly crackling, tuned to a station that hadn't existed in years. When one of the deputies leaned closer, he swore he heard a voice repeating a phrase in a low whisper, something about the gate being open. Sheriff Ray ordered the car to be towed, but that night, before it could be moved, the vehicle caught fire in the impound lot. The flames burned hot enough to melt the windshield. By the end of the week, the case was quietly closed. Sheriff Ray listed it as a voluntary disappearance, though no one believed that, not even him. A week later, he resigned and left Willow Creek for good, leaving behind nothing but his badge and a single sheet of paper on his desk, a map of the Hollow with a circle drawn in red ink around a single word written in his shaky hand: first. Sheriff Amos Ray had worn his badge for nearly 20 years, a quiet man known for his patience and steady hand. But after Clara Boone's disappearance, something in him changed. He stopped showing up at the diner for his morning coffee, stopped greeting people by name at Sunday service. Those who saw him said he looked older, like the light had drained from behind his eyes. He told his deputies to drop the search after the first week, claiming there was no evidence of foul play. Yet, his voice trembled every time he said it. It wasn't long before whispers began spreading through Willow Creek that the sheriff had seen something in those woods, something he refused to talk about. Late one evening, about 3 days before he resigned, Ray stopped by the local tavern and ordered a drink, something he hadn't done in years. A few regulars were their old men who knew when to talk and when to stay quiet, but even they noticed the way he kept glancing at the window, as if expecting someone to appear outside. He muttered to himself, words barely audible over the hum of the jukebox, something about the eyes in the trees and the hymn that doesn't stop. When one of the locals asked if he'd found Clara's trail, he looked up, startled, and said, "I found where she went. But it wasn't a place meant for us." The next morning, he showed up at the station, pale and shaking. He told his deputies the case was closed, no foul play, no leads. He typed up a report that read more like a confession than an investigation. His notes described strange sounds in the forest, a low vibration like breathing, and lights that shimmered just beyond the tree line. He'd gone out there alone, he wrote, following a faint humming that led him deep into the woods. He didn't remember how long he walked, but when he returned to his car, the sun had moved hours ahead. He was certain he hadn't been gone more than 10 minutes. That same day, he packed up his office and handed his badge to Deputy Carson Mills without a word. Before leaving, he placed an envelope in the evidence cabinet marked Clara Boone, do not open. Mills said he watched the sheriff drive off toward the east road that cut through the mountains. The truck was found 2 days later, parked on the shoulder near the hollow, the driver's side door open, engine still running. The seat was empty. Inside the glove compartment was a single page torn from his notebook, with the words written in thick, dark ink, "Don't let them sing again." In the years that followed Sheriff Amos Ray's disappearance, Willow Creek became a town that learned to forget. People stopped asking questions, stopped walking too close to the woods, and when strangers came through asking about the hollow, the townsfolk simply shook their heads and said they'd never heard of it. But silence has a way of rotting from the inside. Between 1993 and 2020, more names began to vanish from the county's records, first a handful, then dozens, until the total reached 312. The disappearances came slowly at first, each one spaced by months or even years, but the pattern was undeniable. The missing were always travelers, drifters, or people who'd come seeking the community that once called itself the Gathering of the Hollow. They'd be seen buying supplies in town, asking for directions toward the woods, then gone by morning. At first, law enforcement from nearby counties tried to get involved. State investigators combed through old files and questioned locals about the abandoned chapel deep in the trees, but every trail ended in the same way, with their reports dismissed or sealed. No evidence, no bodies, no witnesses. The land records for the area surrounding the hollow were confusing, filled with overlapping ownerships and missing signatures. It was as if the place had erased itself from the map. A few determined reporters tried to make sense of it, writing articles that spoke of cult activity and mass disappearances, but each story ended abruptly when its writer either quit or relocated without explanation. Those who had lived near the hollow began locking their doors before sunset. They told stories of hearing hymns echoing faintly from the forest, of seeing lantern lights bobbing in the distance where no one should have been. Farmers found livestock mutilated in precise, deliberate ways, never eaten, just marked. A few families packed up and left the county altogether, swearing they'd seen faces watching from the edge of the tree line at night. By 2010, the disappearances had become folklore, something the older generation warned children about to keep them from wandering too far. Then, in 2015, a man named Daniel Cross, who had been hiking through Kentucky's backroads, posted online about strange figures he'd seen near the hollow. 2 days later, his post vanished, and so did he. The number climbed quietly after that, unnoticed by most, until an anonymous user compiled the missing persons into a single document, 312 names, each connected by the same coordinates, the same stretch of forest that had once belonged to a forgotten church. Whatever the Gathering of the Hollow had been, it hadn't died, it had been waiting. When Ethan Cole arrived in Willow Creek in the autumn of 2020, the town had long since stopped expecting outsiders. He wasn't a cop or a reporter, though people mistook him for both. He was a podcaster, known for digging into cold cases and forgotten disappearances, the kind that left more questions than clues. His series, Into the Static had built a loyal following online for exposing what others refused to touch. When he heard about the 312 missing people tied to a single, obscure religious community in eastern Kentucky, He knew it wasn't just another ghost story, it was a pattern. He rented a run-down cabin on the outskirts of town, close enough to the woods to hear their endless whispering but far enough to see the faint lights of civilization on the horizon. The people of Willow Creek didn't welcome him. The woman who handed him the cabin keys refused to meet his eyes. The old man at the gas station warned him that the GPS didn't work right near the hollow and that the forest plays tricks on you. Every question he asked was met with silence or half-truths. Still, Ethan was patient. He'd spent years learning how to get people to talk, to let their fear slip into words. He visited the diner every morning, ordered the same burnt coffee, and slowly began asking about the disappearances. Some laughed it off as old folklore. Others grew quiet and muttered that the past was better left buried. But one night, a waitress named Ruth slipped him a folded piece of paper as she refilled his cup, an address scrawled in shaky handwriting and a single line beneath it, * she was one of them. *. That address led him to a decaying farmhouse deep off the main road, where he met a woman who claimed to have once lived in the hollow. She refused to let him record, refused even to step into the light of his camera, but she talked. Her voice trembled as she spoke of a preacher who promised salvation through the awakening of the gate, of nights filled with chanting that grew louder until the air itself seemed to hum. She said that after every ceremony, someone would disappear, taken, not sacrificed, but given. Ethan pressed her for details, but she only told him that the hollow wasn't abandoned. They still wait, she whispered, and when the voice calls again, more will follow. Before he could ask what that meant, she slammed the door shut and told him to never come back. When he returned to his cabin that night, the woods were completely silent, yet he could swear he heard someone humming the same low hymn she had described. The discovery of the map came by accident. Ethan Cole had been staying in the cabin for nearly 3 weeks, and his investigations had led nowhere but dead ends and closed doors. Locals either refused to talk or warned him to leave while he still could. One night, during a heavy rainstorm, the power went out, and Ethan, looking for something to occupy the hours, began rummaging through the old drawers of the cabin. Most of what he found was ordinary: a few yellowed newspapers, rusted tools, and a broken compass. But in the back of a warped desk drawer, he found a folded sheet of parchment sealed in a Ziploc bag, brittle and stained with water damage. It was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding forest, marked with rough sketches of ridges, rivers, and forgotten trails that didn't appear on any of his digital maps. At the bottom corner, written in faded black ink, was a signature that read AR, the same initials of the missing Sheriff Amos Ray. At first, Ethan thought it was just an old search map from the 1990s case of Clara Boone, but as he studied it under the dim glow of his lantern, he noticed something unsettling. Across the expanse of the hollow, someone had drawn dozens of small spirals, tight, looping symbols etched in black ink, clustered around certain parts of the woods. Each spiral had a number beside it. Ethan realized they corresponded roughly to the dates of the missing persons reports he'd compiled. The spirals started near the old chapel ruins and spread outward over time, as if tracing an infection across the land. Near the center of the forest, one spiral was drawn larger than all the rest, encircled in red, with a single word written beside it: mouth. Ethan cross-referenced the markings with modern maps and found that many of them lined up perfectly with known disappearance sites. He pinned the locations on his laptop, forming a pattern that spiraled inward like a vortex, leading straight toward an uncharted patch of land deep in the hollow. His pulse quickened as he realized that whoever had made this map had known, even predicted, where people would vanish. The next morning, Ethan returned to town and asked about the area marked mouth, but everyone denied knowing anything. The few who looked at the symbol turned pale and refused to speak another word. When Ethan showed the map to the woman who had once lived in the hollow, she gasped, clutched his wrist, and whispered, "You shouldn't have that. It isn't a place, it's a call." That night, Ethan pinned the map to his wall, unable to shake the feeling that the spirals weren't just locations, they were invitations. Ruth was the only person in Willow Creek who spoke of the hollow as if it were still alive. She was in her 60s, her eyes clouded with age and memory, her voice a frail whisper that cracked when she mentioned the name Father Jeremiah. Ethan met her again a week after she'd given him the address, this time by her own invitation. Her house stood at the far edge of town, half swallowed by vines, its windows covered with newspapers from decades ago. Inside, The air smelled of dust and burnt sage. She warned Ethan not to record anything, and he agreed, sitting quietly as she lit a single candle between them. Then, without looking up, she said the words that would change everything: "The hollow still holds the passage." Ruth told him she had joined the community in 1992, drawn by Father Jeremiah's promises of renewal and eternal life. He preached that the world was corrupt, that the hollow was sacred ground untouched by sin, a place where the veil between this life and the next grew thin. At first, everything felt pure. The people shared food, sang hymns, and built their lives around the chapel in the woods. But soon, things began to change. Father Jeremiah started speaking of voices he heard in the forest, voices that told him the earth beneath their feet was not soil, but the threshold. He claimed the hollow was not just land, it was a gate. Every new moon, he led ceremonies deep among the trees, calling them the openings. Only those who were fully devoted could attend, and no one who entered the inner circle ever spoke of what happened afterward. Ruth went to one of those ceremonies once, before she fled. She described torches placed in a circle, the ground carved with spiraling symbols like the ones on Ethan's map. There was singing, low, rhythmic, and endless, until something began to move beneath the soil, a vibration that made her bones ache. The people swayed in unison as Father Jeremiah raised his arms and told them that to reach paradise, the door must be opened. Then the ground split. Not wide, not deep, but just enough for her to see something breathing under the dirt, something that shimmered like oil and whispered her name. She ran before the ceremony ended, but she could still hear them chanting behind her. She said the hollow demanded offerings, not sacrifices, and that those who vanished hadn't been taken, they had been chosen to go through the passage. When Ethan asked what the passage led to, Ruth trembled, looked toward the dark window, and said, "Not heaven. Something that wears its face." Ethan had grown used to strange occurrences during his investigations, but nothing unsettled him quite like what began happening to his recordings. It started small, almost unnoticeable, faint static in the background, short bursts of distortion, words that seemed to echo out of sync with his own speech. At first, he blamed the cheap recorder he carried everywhere, the one he used to document every lead, every conversation. But when the static began forming patterns, he knew something was wrong. Late one night, while reviewing an interview he had done with Ruth, he noticed a section where her voice cut out completely. For 6 full seconds, the audio was silent, then replaced by a faint whisper, low and rhythmic, repeating something he couldn't quite make out. When he slowed it down, the words became clearer, a series of numbers that resembled coordinates. He cross-checked them and found they pointed to a location right in the heart of the hollow, near the same area marked Mouth on Sheriff Ray's map. Ethan tried to rationalize it, telling himself it was some kind of coincidence or a prank left by whoever had owned the recorder before him. But the next day, when he recorded a follow-up note, his own voice vanished from the playback. Instead, there was whispering again, not one voice this time, but several, layered over each other, chanting the same numbers in unison. The tone wasn't human. It was too steady, too synchronized, and it continued for nearly a full minute before cutting off with a deep, guttural sound, like air being sucked from a cavern. Ethan began testing every device he owned. His laptop microphone, his phone, even a brand new recorder all produced the same anomaly whenever he spoke about the hollow. If he talked about anything else, the town, the people, even the weather, the recordings were fine. But the moment he mentioned the forest or the map, the audio warped again. Once, when he left the recorder running overnight, he woke to find it still recording 8 hours later, the file size enormous. He played it back and heard what sounded like movement inside the cabin, footsteps circling the recorder, slow and deliberate. Then came a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispering his name over and over until the sound broke into static. The final straw came when he replayed his own narration for the upcoming episode of Asterisk into the static star. Midway through, his voice shifted pitch and began speaking words he hadn't recorded, the same coordinates again, repeated with growing intensity, followed by a single sentence in his own tone, "They're waiting for you to listen." Ethan could no longer ignore the pull of the coordinates. Every lead, every sound, every fragment of Ruth's confession pointed to one place, the heart of the hollow. For days he debated whether to go, pacing his cabin while the map pinned to the wall seemed to draw him closer with every passing hour. Finally, one gray morning before dawn, he packed a flashlight, his camera, a small recorder, and the map marked with spirals, then set off into the woods. The air grew colder the deeper he went, the forest unnaturally quiet except for the crunch of his boots on the damp ground. The path he followed was barely visible, swallowed by moss and roots, as though nature itself wanted to erase it. Yet, the further he walked, the more he sensed the faint hum Ruth had described, not a sound, but a vibration in the air, like the low note of a distant organ. After nearly 2 hours, he reached what looked like the remains of a chapel. The structure was half buried in the earth, its wooden frame blackened by rot and time. Ivy crawled up the walls, and a broken steeple leaned at an angle that seemed unnatural, as if forced downward rather than fallen. Inside, the air was thick and damp. The pews had long since collapsed, and the pulpit was nothing but splinters. But beneath the altar, Ethan noticed something that didn't belong, a trapdoor made of rusted iron, its surface carved with symbols that matched the spirals from his map. The edges were clean, too clean for a place abandoned nearly 3 decades ago. Someone had been here recently. Ethan hesitated before opening it, his flashlight flickering as though reacting to the air itself. When he pulled the handle, a gust of cold, stale wind rushed upward carrying a faint metallic smell. The narrow tunnel below was lined with stone and dirt, leading into darkness that swallowed his light almost immediately. He lowered himself down, each step echoing softly against the hollow walls. About 20 feet in, he found markings etched into the stone, spirals again, drawn in blackened residue that looked too much like soot or dried blood. As he walked deeper, the hum grew louder, forming a low resonance that made the walls seem to vibrate. Then he found it, an open chamber beneath the earth, perfectly round, its floor covered in uneven carvings that pulsed faintly under the beam of his light. In the center lay a pit, shallow but wide, filled with dark water that rippled though no air moved. Ethan crouched beside it, holding up the recorder, whispering a single note into the microphone. What came back through his headset wasn't his own voice, but a quiet whisper repeating in time with the water's movement, "You've found the mouth." The night of the eclipse arrived like an omen. The townspeople of Willow Creek had spoken of it for weeks in hushed tones, warning each other to stay inside, to keep their lights low, to let the darkness pass without interference. Ethan, however, saw it as an opportunity, a chance to witness whatever the Hollow had been building toward. He had spent the previous day preparing his equipment, charging his camera batteries, setting fresh tapes into his recorder, and marking the path he would take back to the underground chamber. The air felt different that evening, charged and heavy, as though the sky itself was waiting for something. Clouds moved unnaturally fast, and the forest seemed to exhale as he stepped beneath its shadow. He reached the chapel remains just before midnight. The eclipse had begun, and the moon above was slowly bleeding into shadow, casting the woods in a dim red glow. As he approached the tunnel, he noticed something that hadn't been there before, torches burning in the distance, scattered among the trees, flickering like eyes watching him move. Voices drifted through the woods, low and melodic, chanting in a rhythm that made his heartbeat match their tempo. He started recording, his voice steady but his hands trembling. The coordinates whispered in his earlier tapes had led him precisely here, and now he could hear what Ruth had called the opening hymn. The deeper he moved into the forest, the clearer the chanting became. Dozens of figures stood in a wide clearing encircling the ruins of another structure, the old meeting hall of the Hollow. They wore tattered white garments that glowed faintly under the red light of the moon. In the center of the circle stood an altar, crude and ancient, carved with the same spiral marks that haunted Ethan's map. Father Jeremiah's followers, or their descendants, were performing the ritual Ruth had described. The hymn rose and fell like breathing, and then the ground began to tremble. Ethan aimed his camera toward the center as the earth split open in a jagged line, revealing a deep chasm from which the same low hum emerged, louder than ever. The air smelled of metal and ash, and a faint mist poured upward as if the forest itself were exhaling. He kept recording, whispering into his mic that he could see something moving within the pit, shapes that didn't have form, like shadows made of sound. The chanting grew frantic, desperate, until a blinding flash of light consumed the clearing. His final words on the recording were almost inaudible, carried on a trembling breath, "It's looking back." After that, the tape went silent except for the faint sound of wind and water. Ethan Cole was never seen again. 2 years after Ethan Cole's disappearance, the Hollow had grown quiet again. The story of the missing podcaster became just another whisper in a town built on silence. His cabin still stood near the edge of the woods, abandoned, its windows coated in dust and ivy creeping up the siding. Inside, the walls were covered with newspaper clippings, maps, and notes written in frantic handwriting, coordinates, timestamps, and questions with no answers. The police found his belongings neatly arranged, as if he had intended to return. His camera, laptop, and recorder were missing. For months, search parties combed the forest and drained nearby ponds, but not a single trace of him surfaced. It was as though the Hollow had claimed him the same way it had claimed the others. Then, in early spring of 2022, 2 hikers found something half-buried near a creek bed about 4 miles from the old chapel ruins. It was a waterproof camera, its casing cracked but intact. When the authorities reviewed the footage, they discovered it contained several hours of recordings, each time-stamped during the night of the lunar eclipse. The video was shaky, the audio distorted by wind and static, but parts of it were clear enough to piece together. Ethan had filmed his journey into the forest, capturing glimpses of the torches, the chanting, and the shadows moving between the trees. At one point, the lens focused on a figure standing far off in the dark, a tall, thin shape that appeared human but whose head moved in unnatural, stuttering motions, as if caught between frames. Halfway through the footage, Ethan turned the camera toward himself, his eyes wide, face pale, breathing uneven. He whispered that he had found the mouth, and that the ground was alive. His voice broke as he said something about the door being open, and the screen flickered violently. The last few minutes of the video showed only fragments, torchlight spinning, hands reaching, a sound like rushing water mixed with whispers. Then, as the picture began to fade, Ethan's voice returned, softer now, almost calm. "They're not gone," he said, staring into the camera. "They're waiting." When investigators attempted to digitize the footage, the file corrupted itself 3 times, leaving only a short clip playable, a still image of the forest under red moonlight, with faint movement in the shadows behind the trees. Audio experts claimed they could hear faint voices hidden beneath the static, repeating the same pattern of numbers that had haunted Ethan's recordings. The equipment was sealed in evidence, but everyone who handled it reported the same thing afterward, that for days, whenever they closed their eyes, they could hear the low hum of something breathing underground.